Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared Leary. In this episode, I'm interviewing Jon Stapleton. In our discussion, we're going to speak about metaphors for education and facilitating, the importance of community and navigating inappropriate content online, how programming languages and platforms influence learning, some of the theories and philosophies that inform Jon's practice, and some critical code studies, as well as a bunch more other topics. Jon and I met a few years ago when he was an undergrad presenting at an international conference. He is a very impressive individual, and we definitely talk nerdy in this episode. So if you're into talking about CS Educator as a dungeon master, or at least the metaphor of, not the literal, then this is an episode for you, as well as if you are really interested in talking about theory and philosophy and diving a little bit deeper. With that being said, this is a longer episode, so I'd like to keep this intro short. So we will begin with Jon introducing himself.
I am Jon Stapleton. I work in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. I teach high school computer science, mostly programming, but some intro stuff and a little bit of cybersecurity every once in a while. My background is in music education, and so I feel like I'm kind of between two worlds a little bit.
So tell me how it came to be that your Twitter bio starts with computer science educator and recovering music teacher.
It's kind of a long story, but basically what happened is I started my journey as a teacher wanting to teach music. I kind of came to realize that while I love music, I love teaching music, and I love a lot of stuff about being a music teacher, I wasn't a good fit for maybe the jobs that would be out there for me as a music teacher. I really like working with technology. I really like helping kids make cool stuff, but a lot of what your job is when you're a music teacher, it can be, depending on where you live and what school you're in and stuff, it can be just you teach band and you do the marching band and you get scores at these competitions, and that's kind of what your metric of success is. And I would have been really frustrated by that.
Yeah, for people who are listening as an outsider, there's a whole field of like music technology that you can do, but that's not the norm. Most of it is general music or large ensembles. So the technology integration and whatnot is like a side thing that you might be able to do, like 10% of your time or 20%. It's not as common to find like a full-time gig just doing music technology.
Yeah, and it kind of got to the point for me personally where I like the thought of having to spend most of my time conducting a band just seemed like the worst possible thing. And like, that's not a judgment on people who like doing that. I mean, that's right. There's something for everyone. But like the reason I teach is because I want to help people make cool things. And I really like coding. I was coding as a hobby before I had even thought about being a computer science teacher. And so it seemed like a nice fit. It's like, oh, this is kind of a cool area. It's still developing. There's not too many traditions or patterns that I need to fall into yet. I can kind of forge my own path. And that was really appealing to me. I say recovering because, getting a degree is hard, and I I feel a little bit burned out on music right now. It's still part of why I teach, but it's more of a joke than anything else. Maybe it's not a good joke, but but that's what it is. I still feel like being an arts educator is a kind of core part of my teaching identity. It's just not my only part of my teaching identity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how did these interests in computer science and music kind of evolve in parallel or diverge from each other?
Well, I learned how to code by kind of trying to create my own musical instruments. So that was kind of like they've always been intertwined for me. And I got really into artistic coding, like the art coding scene, like the installation stuff and like the sound art pieces and like the cool visualizations and like evolving art, like visual textures and stuff that people were doing, like digital humanities things seemed really cool to me. So it kind of evolved in parallel because as I was learning about pedagogy through teaching music, I was also kind of contextualizing that stuff in like, okay, what if this was bigger than just teaching a large ensemble, teaching a band? What if this was like kind of a more holistic, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary space? What would that look like to help people be creative, not just with musical instruments or even with the trappings of visual art? What if it was this kind of creative approach to teaching was grounded in computer science and coding and making software? And that's kind of been my focus since then, is trying to make my computer science classes more like an art or music class than a science class, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I approached my class. I was trying to make it arts-based coding classes, the K-8 classes that I worked with. And the makerspace space was a media arts and technology makerspace. So arts was like a huge thing. So
Yeah.
I get it. But what I'm curious about is you said that you taught yourself how to code doing these things.
Yeah.
How did you do that? And how might you recommend teachers who maybe they've taught other subject areas and are now being asked to do computer science or are now on their own deciding to do this? How would you recommend that they learn how to code or how to do computer science in a classroom?
I might be kind of a bad person to ask. I'm of the mind that it's great to figure out how to integrate coding into tons of stuff because it can enrich so much, or integrate other subjects into a computer science class or whatever direction you're going. But you can't substitute the like creative practice of doing it. Like you would never take a art class from someone who doesn't know how to do some sort of visual art. That practice of having that like experience of trying to be creative is so important. You don't have to be amazing, especially, I mean, I'm from Virginia and we're trying to kind of bootstrap this computer science education community here among practicing teachers. And there's a lot of talk about doing integration with other core subjects, but there's not enough talk about people actually training to be programmers or computer scientists. There's not the time devoted to trying to make something cool and learning how that connects to everything else. I don't know that you necessarily have to do it before you can teach it. I think that you can probably learn while teaching and like learn along with the people in your class. But that decision to make something and like have a goal in mind, some kind of like interesting or rich or intrinsically kind of attractive kind of end product in mind, whether that's educative or aesthetic or whatever. It's so important because that kind of drives the communities that you interact with and you become a part of. It drives the like domain that you end up specializing in. And because like coding is huge, it's all this information, all these different practices that are kind of on this huge umbrella. And learning coding for one thing is not the same as learning coding for something else. And ultimately, you're going to be part of a community when you learn how to code. If you're not part of a community of coders who are doing something, they're coding something. Like there's always a modifier after that. Like say I'm learning how to code. Well, what are you learning how to code? Code what? That's the big question for me. And so whenever someone asks me like, "Hey, how can I learn how to be a coder?" I'm like, "Well, you got to like figure out something to make and make that. Like start small, but you can't sit and absorb through osmosis the stuff that would make you a better teacher if you're trying to get people to be creative."
I had a heated discussion with an administrator one time when I was trying to argue for providing more professional development time in the district that I was in. And this particular administrator did not think that we needed more time because all we needed to focus on was pedagogy and not the content knowledge. Her argument was that you did not need to know how to code and how to do computer science in order to run a coding class. And my analogy was, okay, so do you think that you would be able to go into a band class and teach a band how to play a song if you've never played an instrument and don't know how to read music? And her response was, yes, not as well as you could because you have a background in it, but because I have a solid understanding of pedagogy, I'd be able to teach a band class. And I almost fell out of my chair because I very strongly disagreed with that, in that you have to have some kind of an understanding. But to kind of like argue with myself and to give a little pushback with what you're saying, but we've got this like shortage of coding and computer science educators, and we've got people who are interested in it. So how do we get them those resources or that time to get to at least being able to engage with kids? You don't have to be an expert right away, but I would argue that if you are going to be teaching a coding or a CS class, that you need to eventually become an expert in that domain. It doesn't need to be immediate, but like you need to be working towards that constantly. So that way it's not just like, well, I don't know what to do or where we're going next.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like this problem is really complicated. There isn't one solution to getting enough computer science teachers to teach everyone computer science. But the question I would ask first is, one, why does everyone need to know computer science? I'm not saying that everyone shouldn't. I have my own reasons for believing that lots of people should know how to code. But I'm curious why X administrator, X superintendent, whoever it is, wants everyone to know how to code.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that question drives the rest of it.
Yeah.
So if the answer is, well, everyone's going to need to know how to code so they can get a job after high school, well, show me the data. What do they need to know how to code? Because that informs what we need to teach teachers. That's the fundamental question. But then beyond that, beyond the question of whether or not we need to teach everyone computer science, we should have some coding teachers, and we don't have any. We basically don't have any. So what do we do about it? And I think that there needs to be some investment in the concept of the teacher artist. And this is something from music and art education that people are really, really good at talking about this, so much so that it's almost like taken for granted that this is a thing. That the teacher in the classroom is not just a pedagogue, but also an artist in and of themselves. And they have creative agency and kind of a mandate to be creative in this context. I don't know that we have that mindset in computer science right now, that the teacher isn't just an expert teacher or an expert coder, but they are an artist. And that teacher artist role is kind of the foundation of any strong classroom culture or strong learning experience.
So with my background, like I understand where you're coming from, but people who might not have read about teacher as artists, what would you describe what a teacher as an artist might look like versus somebody who is not?
When I'm planning my curriculum, or when I'm planning a lesson, or I'm planning a project or something like that, I'm not thinking about, I don't start from the programming content knowledge that needs to be transmitted. I'm starting from what are we interested in creating? And so that always starts with a conversation with my classmates, my students, my colleagues, whoever I'm working with in that moment. And from there, we're kind of collaboratively designing stuff, and we're treating ourselves as a collective of artists who are trying to say something about the world using the stuff we make, not necessarily a collective of entrepreneurs who are trying to solve a problem. Sometimes people are interested in solving problems. And so our artistic endeavor is to solve problems.
Right.
And that's great. But sometimes we're just interested in making something that's really cool, or really disturbing, or really fun,
right.
or whatever. And that's but we're coming into it with a mission of what to put out into the world that will represent us. And then from there, as a teacher, I kind of flip that in my mind, and I'm thinking, okay, how can I weave in all the different content and skills and practices that these students need to have in order to, one, meet the standards set by the state, and two, more importantly, be successful in their creative mission. Now that creative, like that cycle of project cycle is what it's not the super inventive name, but that's what I call it in my classes. That project cycle can be long. It can be a whole year, or it can be short. It can be 2 weeks or a week or less. And we might do a bunch of those throughout the year, or we might just take on a really ambitious project, and it takes a lot of time to make it work. But when I'm in the classroom with students, I'm a team member. I'm part of that process of trying to help them create that thing. And sometimes I'm leading more, and sometimes I'm just stepping back and like throwing out clues. But I'm not playing the role of the expert transmitting knowledge for them to replicate and prove to me that they know. I'm not playing the role of somebody who is their boss, who's trying to get them to do something specific. I'm playing the role of a co-creator, a collaborator, or a facilitator.
Yeah, so I think that actually ties into a lot of interviews that I've done that are going to be released by the time this episode comes out, but you haven't had the chance to listen to yet, John. It's one of the reasons why in an interview with Bob Irving, I talk about reading outside of the field. So don't just read computer science education research, read educational research from other subject areas, but then read stuff outside of the field of education in general, because you'll constantly be learning new things.
Yeah.
So what you described is similar to what Bob describes, and he has a background in humanities, which is similar to what Sandy describes, which she has a background in computer science as a professional, which is also similar to what Katie describes, but she has a background as a second grade and fourth grade teacher. So like we're all kind of converging on this same idea of facilitating and kind of like leading with the kids, not like stepping in front of them, but kind of like walking along beside them and maybe guiding here and there, but then taking a step back and letting them kind of choose their own path. So it's all kind of coming together, in my mind at least, with episodes that will have released by the time this one comes out.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. And I don't know that I'd necessarily vibe with the word facilitation. It might just have too much baggage for me, but...
In what way?
Well, I'm trying to unpack it a little bit. I'm not sure, because sometimes it is facilitative. Sometimes I am kind of, and this is the metaphor that I use a lot, is when you create instructional material or like an example or a tutorial video or something for students to play with and experiment with, that's like dropping an artificial reef to the bottom of the ocean, right? The goal is that you drop that reef into the right place so that and this is a pretty ham-fisted metaphor. I don't know anything about marine biology, but you drop it to the bottom of the ocean. The idea is that life forms can kind of take that and make it their home, and they change it and adapt to it. And it's kind of a spark that kind of helps kickstart a community. And then eventually, hopefully, that community is creating their own structures to build off of. And you kind of become a participant rather than the person who's dropping those artificial reefs. And sometimes you need to drop more than one. I mean, probably more more often than not, you need to drop more than one to kind of get things going. And it's a little more complicated than that, obviously, because no kid is going to interpret that action in the same way. Not every kid is going to latch on to the things that you throw at them. So it's more complicated and it's more relational than the way I'm describing it. I feel like facilitation sometimes, not always, is used as a term to describe a person who knows better setting up a sandbox, when in reality, I think it can be more egalitarian than that, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So I've described myself as a facilitator for years because of my issues with teacher, in that it seems a bit more one direction in terms of I am the person with knowledge and you are the person receiving the knowledge. And I know not everyone views it that way, but I was trying to find a way to describe what I was doing. And so I say I design and facilitate educational experiences.
Yeah.
Trying to put myself like at the same level, not above, not below, but just kind of like learning alongside, because I learn from kids, they learn from me, we learn from each other, they learn from each other, etc.
Yeah.
But facilitation, it's not a word that I'm like sold on, like this is it, this is exactly describing what I'm doing.
And I don't know if this belongs in this podcast or not, but I kind of feel like sometimes facilitation and project-based learning and some of these more progressive philosophies of teaching are kind of used as a cop-out to avoid requiring the teacher to be an expert, or to be someone who comes in with a lot of community capital, or someone who comes in with a lot to offer. Sometimes it seems like, say, oh, well, you don't know any of this, but that's okay because you're going to learn alongside the students and it'll be emergent, and that's okay because you're facilitating. That's true to a point, but also it's lateral. It's not above the students, but the teacher needs to be a different kind of collaborator than a peer is most of the time. Sometimes, I mean, I'm not going to ever say that everything needs to be one way, but I worry a little bit. I was going back to the professional development piece, that sometimes people come in and they say, well, you got to teach computer science now. And it's okay that you don't know anything about computer science because you're going to be learning alongside the kids. And great, please learn alongside the kids. But also, is that really going to be a good experience for the kids? I don't know. Maybe.
It depends. When you are positioning yourself as a co-learner or facilitating, or however you want to describe it, you also at some point need to know where you're going, where you can go and where you cannot go, or you're just going to run into walls or troubles that are not necessary for students to engage in. So as an example, there was a Scratch project that a kid was working on and they really wanted to do this thing. And I was like trying to give them space to experiment with it. It eventually got to a point where it's like, oh, well, that very specific thing you're trying to do, you actually can't do very well in Scratch because I've tried doing it before. So here's an alternative thing that I'm going to guide you towards. Yeah. And because I knew that, I was able to prevent hours of frustration trying to get this thing to work for them. So that's just kind of an example. Like, you need to know where you're going down the road, but you don't necessarily need to be the expert and all-knowing, I can answer every question kind of a thing. There are many times where like I'd come back the next day and be like, okay, I thought about your question some more, and here's what I found out. Here's the process I took to figure out that question or the answer to the question.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's got to be a balance, as in all things. I've been really thinking a lot about the pedagogy framework that I'm coming at things with, and I've recently started playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons with my friends, and I've been haven't had an affinity for that stuff for a long time. It's basically like the only media I consume now is watching people play Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm what we call the dungeon master, which is kind of a like oppressive sounding term, but the role of the dungeon master is to be the like kind of the manager of the world, and the person who comes up with a lot of the story, and they play the part of everyone except for the players, who each play one individual player in this vast world of monsters and magic and towns and cities and guards and all this stuff. And there's a shocking number of parallels to good teaching, in that you are a player in the game. So part of the whole point is for you to have fun. So if you're running a game and you hate it, even if players are having a great time, you're not doing what you need to do. Like you are situated in the game with a lot of responsibility, but also as someone who's supposed to be having fun with everyone there. That to me kind of gets at some of the nature of teaching in some contexts where you have a lot of responsibility to make sure everyone can feel successful and to kind of participate in this experience that has a certain level of verisimilitude where things seem real and the stakes seem real and you're not just going through the motions. But also, you're responsible for playing the game with the people at the table, not for the people at the table. Does that make sense?
Yes. Having played a little bit of Dungeons and Dragons, it makes perfect sense to me. And I think it'll make sense to people who haven't played it, just that description you gave.
Perfect.
Just a quick note, verisimilitude means kind of lifelike for people who haven't come across that word. It's used frequently in qualitative stuff.
I'm so glad I used it right.
Yeah, no, you can tell that John is very well read. I'm just kind of picturing here, though, you introducing yourself at like the first meet the teacher night. You'd be like, "Hi, parent. I'm going to be your child's computer science dungeon master." Like,
yeah, that would be awesome. That would go over real well.
like, "Oh, great. We'll be signing
That's the
up
word
with-"
we've been looking for. It's not facilitator. It's dungeon master.
I think you could seriously write something about that. That is a really good way of describing it, how you are kind of designing the experience, but you're also playing the game itself. My wheels are spinning. I'll be thinking about this for days. So thank you.
And the nice thing is that if you ask anyone who DMs dungeon masters, if it's a lot of work, they'll tell you, yeah. And if you ask them, do you need to have some skills to bring to the table when you do this? They'll be like, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not an oppressive kind of, I just popped into the mic. It's not an oppressive kind of situation. It's not, I come in with all of this knowledge and I am the all-knowing being dispensing rules and perilous dungeon crawls from above. It's relational. It's a relational piece. And you're trying to generate fun and engagement and the feeling of progress. And that's so hard for a lot of people. And a lot of novice DMs come into the game and they feel like they either need to be like the encyclopedia or they need to be the vengeful god smiting players from above.
Yep.
And neither of those are good approaches to teaching or any kind of gameplay.
Yeah, that parallels so many of the discussions in the previous interviews on the podcast. It just replaced awesome. DM with teacher facilitator. One of the things that you've mentioned several times is communities. How have computer science communities, or just communities in general, kind of impact how you learned computer science?
I cannot overstate how crucial community, and I use the term extra scholastic just to be very clear about where these communities are situated. Extra scholastic communities have, and that's so clunky, but they've played such a huge role in my education as a teacher and as a musician and as a coder and everything else, given that I've never taken a coding class ever. My primary like musicianship identity is centered around electronic music and dance music and music production. Of course, I haven't taken a class in those either because they're not offered to music teachers, pre-service music teachers. And all of that stuff, it comes from being situated inside of a community. So just to back up a little bit, all knowledge is situated, right? Knowledge exists in relationship to other things and people. You ask the question, what is knowledge situated within? And you say communities, of course, because the thing that you learn is passed down, or you're learning it from someone or something else that is in relationship and in dialogue with other things. And that is, to me, kind of the fundamental goal of education, is not to transmit knowledge, but to fold people into communities of learning and creativity. And these communities are not formalized in that you can find the space where they live. And I mean, you can find spaces where some of them live, but it's my network of mentors who don't know I exist. And those are the people who I think of when I'm trying to figure out how to be a better teacher. And it's complicated because learning like that requires a lot of personal motivation and a resiliency that not everyone should have. Maybe an obsessiveness that not everyone would be happier with. my role as a teacher is to help make that transition into being a community member, or to feeling as if you belong in a community, more smooth and require less kind of trial and tribulation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I've definitely got some questions about how you could apply that in the classroom setting, but I'm curious, what characteristics about the community or how it functioned in particular impacted you?
It was the self-directedness of it, and also importantly the lack of corporate sponsorship. And that sounds kind of like political, and it's because it is. uh, the communities I'm a part of are not a content management system. They're
Mm-hmm.
not a set of modules on Adhesive or whatever, learning platform you're using. It's a bunch of people who are sharing stuff because either someone asked them to share it or they just felt like they would have needed it when they were learning. And that, to me, it's awesome. It's just great. Obviously the situation is not as utopian in reality as what I'm describing. There are lots of problems in online community spaces, and you don't have to look far to find all of the examples of racism and misogyny and oppression and ableism and homophobia and transphobia, all the stuff that you imagine when you think of the dark side of the internet. All that stuff exists. If you're privileged enough to find communities that are safe, it also ends up being a very like a kind of collegial atmosphere. And I do want to say, I use the word privilege intentionally. I present as a white male. I have enjoyed all the privileges associated with that. And so my experience in online communities learning has been shaped by that identity piece. And so I'm fully aware that there are lots of people who may not be able to feel safe in those spaces. And that's another piece of what's informs my teaching philosophy. How can we build better communities where more people can kind of participate in learning and teaching grounded in care and creativity?
Okay, so the $1 million question, how do you try and foster a sense of community with your own classroom? A safe space where kids can learn and share together, like what you described.
Well, that is the question, right? There are a lot of factors that make kids feel unsafe in school. I was not interested in being a teacher for a long time because school felt so oppressive and unsafe.
Hmm.
The solution that I try to do is to first take kids seriously as creative people who have agency. Everyone does. It's just a matter of finding a space where you can kind of flex that muscle and feel like what you do in that space matters. Convincing kids that they're in a space where their voice and their creative output matters and that we care about it is the central challenge of my teaching.
I wrote a whole chapter on affinity spaces, which is an author that I mentioned in several of the podcasts. Mm-hmm. He talks about these informal online spaces and how they work together to learn very complicated things, and they're doing it in an informal context without overt I'm the teacher, you're the student kind of roles. In his writings, he talks about, well, how can we apply this into education? So there are some suggestions on how to do that, but it's difficult to do it in a way that doesn't feel artificial or forced.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, is that I'm split between the idea that the community space in the classroom is the community that we're trying to pull people into. I think that's part of it. But there's also so much outside of the classroom that's so important. And if anything, that stuff is going to be where kids have the richest experiences because they're not bounded by the logistical concerns of being in school. My background leads me to believe that being in class in school is probably not the best way to learn anything. It's probably the most effective way to get everyone to learn something, but maybe not the best way of getting one person to learn the thing they care about. You're also fighting against a lot of the norms and values of a school that run counter to this idea that students are being introduced to communities where they can learn and be creative and have agency. So much of the way school is designed is to take students' agency away and replace it with agency of the teacher and what the teacher believes to be important. One good example, one really practical, close to home example is I'm running my advanced programming class. And just as a disclaimer, this works because I know all these kids really well. I've taught them before. And they also have opted into an advanced level of coursework, and it's not an introductory class. So I don't know how to make this work for an introductory class. Disclaimer. But the way this advanced class is working is they came in. I kind of helped them through some basic stuff to kind of get their skills back up to where they were at the end of their introductory course. Like I was just really upfront and said, the way I want to run this class is that you all make something cool and we do with that product whatever we want. And a bunch of kids were like, oh, we should make a game and sell it. And a lot of kids were like, let's make a game and like open it and like so it's unfiltered and we can play it at school and all that stuff. I kind of like listened to all of that, and that was all valid, and we are making a game together, like as a huge team of 20 people. And I've worked really hard to make sure that I'm providing them with some scaffolds that make it easy to be successful, but I'm not in charge of what they're doing. I'm in charge of making sure that what they're doing is going to end up being a valuable experience, that they learn things. And that this comes back to a lot of the stuff that we have been talking about before, that I'm not focusing on content objectives first. I'm weaving those in as we go.
So one thing that I want to ask about, though, like I'm all for connecting kids with communities outside of the school, but the younger you go in the grade levels, the more likely you're going to run into firewall issues. But then there's also the communities themselves are engaged with by all types of people, ages, whatever. So as an example, in my dissertation, I present some findings on use of swear words in this online community. So on page 232, it talks about that. And then on the image on page 233, it says, oh, over 1,000 times in a single forum post. So how do you kind of navigate that balance between the school community, where it has the school rules and norms and whatnot, the expectations that kids are supposed to follow, and then encouraging them to go into these spaces where they don't have those same expectations, and it might conflict with the school or community values in terms of how to behave and engage online?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. I teach high school. So the conversation I have about this is different than it would be with middle school or elementary school students. I have really strict policies about like misogynist, racist, homophobic, transphobic language, and they know that I feel very strongly about that stuff. That kind of the stuff that I feel like, or that students will feel like, is crosses a line, I'm generally not going to even bring it up. I won't bring that into class to inspect and analyze, because that puts people in a position where they're being asked to be really resilient, even for a little bit of time. We also have a conversation about, hey, I haven't seen everything on the internet, and you might find something that is really bad. If they find a site that's unblocked, that should be, like, we have a responsibility as people who are kind of participating in community spaces to show whoever needs to know that this is potentially being accessed by students or whatever. I mean, and I'm of the mind that there's not a whole lot you can do to shelter students from toxic discourse in online spaces. Mm-hmm. It's going to happen whether or not you talk about it in class. So better to talk about it than not. And I'm not going to ever send someone a link where they're going to find stuff that's inappropriate. I vet my resources very, very, very carefully. So I don't know. It's a tricky situation. I don't really have a good answer. And kids are going to always find stuff, especially the kids who are really motivated to learn on their own, are always going to find stuff before I can get to it. And
yeah, even if you have the best firewall that's going to censor anything that might be deemed remotely inappropriate, kids are still walking around, many of them, with devices that have access to the internet in their pockets or in their backpack. So the fact that you're going to have this conversation about what is and is not considered appropriate content at a particular age group or a way to behave online, like, that's part of digital citizenship 101 that you need to be having. So it's good to have those conversations. You don't necessarily have to expose them to it in a class if you're working with younger kids, but at least talking about, okay, how do you respond to this kind of content, it's kind of necessary nowadays. Like back in the day, like when I was in school, I didn't have a cell phone until high school. So until that point, I didn't have access to the internet unless I was on a computer in class. But walking in the halls nowadays, kids can just pull out their phone.
I can't do anything to prevent a child from encountering extreme propaganda online. But what I can do, hopefully, is have them be primed to critically think about that stuff when they interact with it and know either one, how to kind of box that up in their minds and do something about it, or two, put it in context of the rest of the discourse of communities that we've been talking about in class. But if they are in a space where we've never had a conversation, they've never seen me kind of walk someone through what it's like to encounter whatever online and what to do about it and how to think about it, then I'm putting all the power in the hands of people who are trying to harm students. I think that's kind of what's ending up being the reality of online engagement nowadays, is that you kind of have to be ready to eject yourself at any given moment from a situation, from an online community or a forum thread or whatever you're engaging in, because it can get out of hand. It can get out of hand immediately.
Yeah, I've spoken with some IT people and some administrators who have this fear of technology or a tool because it might allow them to do something that is inappropriate. So some people have said, well, I don't want kids engaging in Scratch because of the online community aspect. I don't know who they're going to talk to, even though it's like policed by the Scratch community. Or I don't want kids engaging with the offline version of Scratch because they might be able to take those characters and make them do stuff that's not appropriate. And my response to that is always like, okay, so are we going to remove pencils from the classroom as well because they might write a curse word or might draw something inappropriate? It's not the tool itself that we need to get rid of. It's how we engage with it in the space that we need to talk about. At least that's just kind of my opinion.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I do think that tools have a lot to say to us about how we can approach the world and each other.
We've had conversations in the past about affordances and constraints of tools. And your mention of the tools kind of reminds me of a conversation we previously had about the affordances and constraints of a language or a coding or CS platform. Could you describe what are some examples of that? How you take that into consideration in your class?
Some background. I think a ton about tools, how we kind of form relationships with them, especially in education. And there's a whole lot of kind of philosophical background that we can get into after we have this, like after we get past this part. But the basic idea here is that the tools have agency. They do things, and they act on us and we act on them, and it's kind of a dialogue. So if I'm using it, and this is kind of borne out in the classic metaphor, like if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. The tool, and then that's kind of an exaggeration, but the tool shapes our way of knowing about things. And so when we bring that to a coding space, our tools are programming languages and frameworks, and the frameworks that you're using are informing how you come to know about programming. The tool that you're using has a lot to say about what makes a good coder, what makes a good programmer, what makes a good software program. That's borne out in a lot of the kind of products that we interact with a lot. You think about material design, or the Apple philosophy of product design, or whatever. That the tools are telling us what's important. They have a political kind of agenda that they are forwarding through their interactions with us. So taking that into an education space, what do our choices of programming language or framework say about what we think makes a good programmer? And then how does that affect who shows up in our class, who feels safe, who feels empowered, who feels disempowered in the classroom? The big thing that I do when I'm choosing tools is, one, I go for open source almost all the time. I feel like that's resonant with the mission of public education. And I run classes where students are choosing their domains that they're focusing on, and I'm not running a domain-specific class. Now, what I mean by domain is a set of skills and practices that are associated with a certain kind of product. So a domain might be game development, or mobile app development, or full stack development, or something like that. That's a domain. And it's great to be able to sign up for a class like that because you get a lot of really like targeted practice on something. But what you do when you do that is you take the creative possibility of programming as a way of knowing and you shrink it down to programming as a means to an end. And I don't want my class to be that way. If a student opts into that path where they are learning this very narrow framework, this very narrow domain, that's great because they've opted in. But if I'm offering a programming class, I'm not going to shrink down that creative possibility to something really narrow that may or may not be enacting a political agenda that I feel like is ethical.
Yeah, I think I'd like to interject example for younger grades just to contextualize it. So like an example, Scratch as a platform and a language. An affordance of Scratch is that you can create all these media arts related things in games. It's block based, so you don't have to worry about syntax. So you don't have to have a high level of reading ability to be able to engage with it, things like that. So those are some affordances. But an example constraint is that because it's so heavily based on the visuals, it is not very conducive to people who are blind. So if you are unable to see or have difficulty with your vision, you would not be able to engage with Scratch as well as somebody who doesn't. But then on the other side, there's something like Sonic Pi, which is text-based, and you write out lines of code which create music. And so as an affordance, it really allows you to synthesize music in an interesting way using code. But as a constraint, it does not allow you to make like the media art stuff that you could do in Scratch in terms of like making a game or characters and whatnot. So whatever platform you end up choosing are going to have these affordances that allow you to do things, and then these constraints that kind of like prevent you from doing other things. So you kind of have to take those into consideration when choosing what kind of platforms that you're going to use. How do you take these different affordances and constraints of a platform, and how do you take into consideration how kids can engage with them and what they can create with them? How does it impact your decisions?
It impacts them fundamentally. I kind of have a library of stuff that I think of when kids come to me with different ideas. And we do a lot of work to help kids come up with ideas. I can't discount that. The kids don't come in, most of the time they don't come in with ideas at all. If you're super lucky, a kid will come in and know exactly what they want to get out of your class. And that's so great because you can just throw like resources and stuff at them and they just like soak it up and make things.
And get bruises.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't like it when I throw it. Yeah. Anyway, but most of my students can't do that. I can't solve that problem for them without teaching them how to come up with ideas. And so we talk about that a lot, and it's not a design thinking kind of thing. We're not trying to solve problems. We're trying to empower them to use their voice with code. And so for a kid who really connects with music and they feel most empowered to use their voice in kind of a musical context, then I'm going to use something like Sonic Pi or any of the other music coding platforms that or have them make like a little sampler thing. Or I mean, there are infinite examples of ways to use sound. And so what I'm doing is I'm picking a tool that makes that path easy. Mm-hmm. Because the stuff that doesn't matter should be easy. The stuff that matters should be discovered. Choosing a language, choosing a platform can feel super high stakes, especially for kids who don't really know what their options are. So I'm not going to let them choose a tool at first. I'm going to either show them a bunch of tools and have them kind of evaluate them based on their perception of the affordances and constraints. But then a lot of times we do the ideation process out of the context of coding. And then I say, okay, so the thing that you chose makes a whole lot of sense for you to start with this. And I show them kind of the basics and then they explore.
That thought process is basically what I took to add on the languages each time I did in the class that I was with. So I mentioned in a previous podcast with Bob Irving that every year or every semester, you can try and add in one more thing. So learn a new language, learn a new platform, and keep building on that if you're new to CS. So you don't have to feel like you're overwhelmed starting with like 10 programming languages at once. And for me, the guiding questions that were, what language or platform should I add, had to do with what are kids interested in that they feel like they cannot do in their current platforms. In other words, if using platform A and B if they feel constrained about making music, then I need to find another platform that is more conducive to that. So like that's how I got to Sonic Pi. And then eventually some kids were like, well, I want to make apps for my device. And we had a lab full of Macs, so we worked with Xcode with Swift to make iOS programs and whatnot. So like those decisions were guided by the interests of the kids that I was working with, even though we still had to take into account the constraints of here are the devices that we have available and the operating systems we're using in this class. What can we do that's interesting?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that not every kid is going to push up against those barriers that the tools present. I really wanted them to when I first started teaching CS, because I wanted to have this kind of language agnostic classroom where everyone was doing all sorts of stuff and we were all learning, like kind of like this diverse knowledge base. I think a lot of kids ended up being pretty frustrated by that. They felt like it was too open. They were like floating in a void as opposed to be floating in a vast sea of endless possibilities, which is kind of a cheesy way to say it. They felt isolated rather than empowered by the choice. This year, I've been kind of focusing on trying to institute some creative constraint, at least at first, and kind of cultivate this willingness to push against the boundaries so that when they do get to a point where they are pushing against the tools they're using, they feel empowered to ask how to get past those constraints, and then we can switch stuff. For people who are listening to this who feel intimidated by the idea of teaching more than one like programming language, then just teach one, because there's so many things you can do, especially if you're teaching high school or older students who might get through the basics a little bit faster. You don't have to worry so much about the tool instituting a lot of constraints on you, because they're using tools that are designed specifically to have a lot of flexibility.
That's a good point.
When you, the tool, especially in ed tech, the tool provides a lot of scaffolding for you. So if you're using Scratch, that tool has a lot of scaffolding to make sure that you can be successful for the purpose that it is designed for. But JavaScript has some constraints. It's going to take students a really long time to get to the point where they're pushing against those constraints. Mm-hmm. But there's always going to be constraints. And when you find the end of those, then hopefully what happens is people either adapt and figure out really cool creative ways of circumnavigating those constraints, or they feel empowered to leave the nest, so to speak, and kind of strike out on their own. And I feel like I suspect, I have no reason to believe this, but I suspect that last step happens a lot out of school and not so much in school. But I didn't use the word affordances and constraints when I talked about tools. And I want to make sure before we move on, I wanted to reframe that a little bit, because tools can have affordances and constraints designed into them. But I also like the language that tools afford and constrain users. It's an active act, because from my perspective, the tools aren't inert. They're not inanimate. They have agency. They are, for lack of a better term, they are alive, given the social context that we have situated them within.
One of the things I appreciate in our discussions that we've had over the years is kind of talking about different theories and philosophies. So I was hoping we could shift into a discussion on that. I'm wondering if you could share some of the ways of knowing or being that kind of influence your approach to education or learning.
The thing I talked about with tools having agency and like the objects being alive comes from a scholar named Jane Bennett. She wrote a book called Vibrant Matter several years ago, where she's kind of exploring the vibrancy, the aliveness of material. And like she uses the term thing power, the power that things have to kind of call to us or draw us in, and the relationships that we form with these objects. It's difficult to talk about this kind of approach. I think some people call it like new materialism. If you're looking for something to Google, it's difficult to talk about it because you have to use metaphor to get at it, because you can't. A lot of people, when you say like, "Hey, the tool is alive," they kind of like balk at that. But if you think about it, like the things that you have and you interact with do have a relationship with you. And you can think about it sort of in terms of like a sentimental attachment to an object. That object is a part of you, if you think about it. And I'm coming at this kind of from a musician's perspective. When you play the saxophone, your body is literally a part of the instrument. There is an unbroken air column that starts somewhere in your lungs and ends at the end of the bell and really extends into the whole room. And you vibrate the air with this air column. So you are a part of this object. This object is a part of you as you're going through this music making process. And so to me, it seems like a no-brainer that these objects have agency and they are alive. I think anyone who spends a lot of time with a thing, you do kind of see the aliveness of it. And then if you're thinking about this from an educational perspective, if you have things in your room, objects, educational technology, and things are alive, then those objects are either students or teachers or both. And you kind of have to think about, okay, what's the pedagogy of this object? What philosophical underpinnings are they bringing to the curriculum? What do they contribute to the room? What relationships do they have with students? Even if you don't really buy the new materialist philosophy, thinking about it metaphorically in those terms can also be really useful, which kind of brings me to another perspective. Bruno Latour's actants, kind of an actant network. Actant is spelled A-C-T-A-N-T. It's something that acts upon something else. And I don't think he went as far as to say that the objects, the actants, have sentience or agency, but thinking about educational technology as an actant upon students is, I think, kind of interesting. And I think about this a lot in terms of constraining tools or scaffolds. These actants are acting upon our knowledge systems and the way that we make meaning of educational experiences.
So what's an example of an actant in CS education?
Sphero is a good example. I mean, we act upon Sphero by programming it and making it do things and breaking it and stepping on it and tripping over it and all that stuff. But Sphero acts upon us too, because we are negotiating some sort of nascent knowledge of programming with Sphero, in dialogue with Sphero. It's acting upon our ontologies, our schemas, I suppose, is one way of saying it. Our understanding of what is programming, what is coding, who's a computer scientist, what does a computer scientist do? If in the classroom Sphero is situated by this context of computer science, then the Sphero is acting upon us and telling us how we should be perceiving its role in computer science. It's not just a vehicle for pedagogy or curriculum. Even vehicle is too strong. The thing is never just the thing. It's situated by the community and the context it's within. And then when we give these objects life by being human with them, they do act upon us. They're stimulus at the very least that we make meaning of. That's kind of one example of an actant. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and a Sphero, for reference, is a little robot that you can program, just in case people haven't come across it. It's a pretty popular one though.
And so this kind of the next step here, if you're going to give like the grand tour of my obsessions in theory and practice, is this idea of dialogicality, that we kind of make meaning of our lives in dialogue with others. There's a German philosopher called Martin Buber, who has this famous thing that he said, I'm going to paraphrase, that we only come to know ourselves by coming to know someone else. And that's kind of one way of kind of thinking about this, that we learn based on this kind of social context, which is pretty well grounded and covered by kind of this progressive constructivist philosophy of education. This idea of dialogicality takes it a step further, that we come to know ourselves by being in dialogue with this vast, decentralized network of competing, simultaneously speaking voices. And these voices give rise to kind of emergent meaning given our position within them. And I mean, being a teacher, I feel like I am kind of surrounded by this vast, disconnected, cacophonous set of chorus of voices that all have this kind of agenda or idea of what computer science education is or should be. And I come to know myself in dialogue with these tools and educators and philosophers and everyone else, either in reaction, being reactionary to something, or by following along and finding people whose voices match my own.
And by voices, you mean like society at large or discourses from the field?
Yeah. Discourses is a good word for it. Because I'm coming at this from kind of a new materialist place, I do also kind of mean the literal voices of the objects themselves. because I am situating dialogicality in my own mind. I'm situating this dialogue within the context of the objects have agency, and so they're part of this conversation.
So you had mentioned constructivism at the start of the podcast, and constructivism, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's the idea that like knowledge is socially constructed, individually understood, and is like therefore unknowable beyond your own understanding of your knowledge. So I can't know what Jon knows and his understanding of reality, but I can attempt to grasp it by like kind of conversing with him. But then there's another idea of constructionism, which is like you learn through doing and creating and making, and like that is typically talked about in CS education, while as constructivism is usually talked about in other areas of education. And what it sounds like is you're kind of taking into account the voices that are inherent within an object itself. And so even if you are constructing something, creating something on your own, you're still engaging in a dialogue, even if you're unaware what the dialogue is and what the objects you're working with are basically inherently telling you.
In constructionism, and this like Seymour Papert, the idea is that the learning by making and doing is kind of assumes the end product. It's productive. There's a product at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I would say to that is when you create something, you're putting a voice out into the world, and that voice is part of this constructive social relationship where you are constructing knowledge and individually kind of reflecting and and synthesizing that as part of your worldview or your knowledge base or whatever you want to call it.
Is that something that is talked about in CS education research?
I have no idea. See, this is the problem, is that I'm not up on the research.
See, and I try to be, but I haven't found yet anyone that's talking about that. So that would be really interesting to see if others are discussing that.
Yeah, I will say that the critical code studies people are kind of getting at this stuff. And critical code studies is the kind of subfield within the digital humanities and some other disciplines, kind of an intersection between many disciplines where people are looking at code itself as a kind of a text to be analyzed and to be understood within the context of social realities. The critical and critical code studies comes from critical theory or critical race studies and stuff like that. And there's a whole bunch of research that gets into that stuff. But the basic idea is that you're looking at how texts or objects or ways of knowing help situate social reality and the impacts that these things have on people's lived experiences. And it's kind of with an eye toward activism and addressing oppression within communities. So an example of critical code studies would be we look at the code of an app that tracks people's locations. And we can kind of make some statements about the way that might impact people's lived experiences, who's being tracked and why. But we can also look at the text of the code and see if the way that it's constructed can offer any insight into its agency in the context of a human social reality. We might look at the text of the code itself. What words does it use? One great example of this is in music, and also actually in a lot of tech fields. We use the term master-slave to describe the relationship between two objects that are communicating with one another. One of them is in charge of the bus that's taking care of passing messages and managing all of the clients. But the traditional term for this is master-slave. We're trying to get away from that, right? Because that has a lot of baggage and says something about our relationship with technology and our relationship to each other. So if we go through the code and we look at the text of the code, what does the text of the code say about us? And how does the text of the code impact our lived social reality given the product that's a part of? And one kind of simplistic way of looking at this, there's a video you can look up on the internet where you have someone who puts their hand under a soap dispenser, and you can see that the person is white. Their hand is under the soap dispenser, and the soap dispenses. And then someone with a darker skin tone, a black person, comes up and puts their hand under the soap dispenser and the soap doesn't dispense. So critical code studies might say, okay, how can we look at the code and come to better understand how this machine is interacting and participating in some oppressive structures that we have been dealing with since before this piece of technology was ever around? How can a piece of technology be racist? Critical code studies is one of the communities that's trying to address that question. When we talk about critical code studies, we're also talking about what we should do about it, and how we can hold people accountable and hold machines accountable for the way that they impact our social reality. And this is kind of a side note. I don't know if this scholar puts themselves under the umbrella of critical code studies, but they're kind of mentioned in that discourse. Safia Noble and the book Algorithms of Oppression. It's a good introduction to this idea, the agency that our objects have in constructing social reality for us. It's about how search algorithms reinforce racial oppression and bias.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a lot of examples of that.
Yeah.
Having read some similar studies. So one of the things that I've kind of found interesting with research and going through these theories and philosophies is sometimes in theory they sound great. And then when you get into a classroom with kids, you try and do it and you go, wow, this isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z. So I'm curious in what ways any theories in general have kind of been out of touch with your experience in the classroom or your day-to-day.
Yeah, totally. That happens all the time. The most important thing, and any teacher will tell you this, is that the most important thing is the relationship with students. Really, like any problem can be solved if you form a good relationship with a student and talk to them about how to solve the problem. So before we get into all the problems with all the theories, like that's the solution for those of you who are interested. Unfortunately, it's a very labor-intensive solution, and it's not necessarily scalable or always healthy for everyone. But that's kind of one cure-all. So theories that don't pan out, totally. So constructivism totally doesn't pan out sometimes because people have to have some intrinsic motivation to create, and that doesn't always happen. It might be because the student doesn't see themselves as creative. It might be because when the first day they came to school, wherever they are, they were immediately smacked to the ground, either or literally or metaphorically, and they no longer feel empowered or have any voice in the classroom. They might also feel like the stakes are either so low or so high as to be completely out of the scope of their lives. There are so many problems, so many different barriers to implementing something like constructivism or project-based learning or whatever that those frameworks don't address. And as a novice teacher, it was very disillusioning to come into a classroom and feel like I am subscribing to a progressive philosophy and kids learn better when I'm just lecturing at them. Very discouraging. The solution there, I think, is not to just lecture at them. I think it's to kind of understand that we are participating in a system that it's incredibly difficult to catalyze change, and you are one cog in this vast educational meat grinder that either like some kids come out okay and a lot of kids don't, and for whatever reason they get chewed up and spit out. And project-based learning doesn't have a whole lot of things to offer to help that problem.
It's important to have these discussions because I personally think there needs to be some kind of experimentation involved with actually taking theories and philosophies and applying them into some kind of a learning experience. And then there needs to be research more on, okay, how did that actually work? Because like in theory, it should do A, B, and C, but what we found is A, B, and Z.
Well, and the other piece here is we have to be, and I know you and I have talked about this before, but we have to be super careful about what we're measuring when we do that, because too often people do this kind of inquiry and they're measuring some sort of content-based or skills-based endpoint when they're trying to figure out if project-based learning is effective. The word effective is used a lot. And it's important to have effective education. I mean, there are some things that just need to happen. Like you need to know how to read.
But effective at what?
Yeah, yeah. We're pretty good at getting most kids to that bare minimum level of self-sufficiency. Um, and obviously at the margins, we have a lot of work to do, especially when we talk about students who are dealing with struggles outside of school, whether that be socioeconomic or dealing with violence or whatever else, and or students with disabilities, students who are differently abled who may not get to the point where they are self-sufficient, given whatever context we're talking about, because of the school structure and the way that things are um, happening for them in their day-to-day lives while they're being educated. It's really important to figure out what we care about when we ask what is good teaching. And when we have to figure out what we're looking for when we are looking for good learning. What does it look like to have high quality learning? And that will hopefully lead us to what constitutes high quality teaching. The traditional method for assessing high quality learning is with tests which are kind of aligned to state standards. And I'm not totally convinced that that is the best way to measure high quality learning. You might suspect, given the things I've said in this podcast, that I don't really vibe with that. It's not that important to me. And honestly, in computer science, I might make some enemies for saying this, but I don't know that the world would be better if we had more really awesome coders. Like I think that the world would be better if we had really creative, empowered, socially conscious people who happen to know how to code. That would be awesome. But the idea that we can change the world for the better by just creating more people who can make software, I think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's not the way to make the human condition improve on the long term.
They haven't released yet at the time of this recording, but there are multiple other interviews where people have reiterated similar things. So
well, that is comforting, indeed.
You're not alone. How are you continuing to evolve or refine what you're doing? Like every year when I was in the classroom looked different than the previous year. When kids would come back, they would be like, "Why didn't we do this when I was here?" And it's like, well, because I'm trying to get better.
Yeah.
If I kept doing the same thing every year, then I'm not growing and I'm not helping you as much as I think I could. So how are you trying to refine things?
Oh man, like so many so many ways. The thing I hope to get way better at in the near future is having the stakes feel real by situating the classroom in the context of the real world. And I think that's the thing that's missing from a lot of my work right now is that when kids come into my class, we're not grounding anything in like a reality of someone or the reality of like when you're a musician, and I keep putting it in the context of music because this is my background, but I think there's a lot of other things that kind of follow this too. When you're a musician, there's a goal, right? That you're going to perform whatever you're doing at some point. You're going to share it with the world, and so those stakes are real. You have to learn the things and get better in order to put on that product, that performance. And I don't want my coding classes to be product oriented because I don't want to be like reteaching startup culture to these kids and creating a whole new generation of people who end up breaking the world. But what I really want to do is have them come into the room and feel like they're being taken seriously and that the stakes for them to show me who they are by being creative are there and real, and that I'm going to value that and the people around them will value that. I'm still trying to figure out how to do that. That's the big one for me right now.
So, what questions have I not asked you that you'd like to discuss?
I mean, I have questions for you about the stuff that you're doing. Like, one of the things I'm struggling with is how to provide this kind of asynchronous and choice based framework for learning code independently. And this just seems like there's so much room for misinterpretation and for like falling through the cracks. Like anytime I make something, like I just to put this in context, Jared, I know you use a lot of video tutorials and stuff for your things. That's like something you do all the time, and I do the same thing. And I also make a lot of text tutorials and like blog posts that walk people through things. And like when I first started making these, I would just have kids copying the code in the videos, which is great to get started.
Hmm.
But then there was never a point where they kind of started to hack into these examples and start building their own thing, because it was an end point. It was convergent rather than being a catalyst for some sort of creative action on their part. So that's crazy that to be able to create things that do that, that are like the seed of something, or like jet fuel for someone who's ready to create something. So difficult. And there's nothing, to me as a learner, there's nothing better than finding that resource that like sets you off and just like, and you just go. Because that, I mean, that's half of the battle, right? I spend hours and hours and hours finding these things that can help me as a learner. As a teacher, I don't think that search matters that much. I feel like kids, if they can just find the thing, they can do it. But maybe it does. I don't know. What's your perspective on that?
So this summer, I did a presentation at ISTE, and I was talking about
Mhm.
project-based learning with Scratch. And in the presentation, I had up on the screen this continuum of project-based learning. And on one end of the continuum, it was fixed. In the middle, it was flexible. And on the other end, it was open. So a fixed project is like, I want you to create a game with 3 sprites, 5 variables, 2 conditions, and it needs to do blah, blah, blah. So like that is like, it's a project that you're creating, but it's very set in stone
Yeah.
what the expectations are. On the other end of the spectrum is, I want you to create something that uses variables. How could you use variables to create something that's interesting to you? And so that being on open, more towards the middle is, okay, you're going to create a game, and it needs to include variables and conditions, but what kind of a game that looks like, that's up to you. I'm not going to dictate how many sprites or how many of each concept or understanding you're going to demonstrate, etc. Just use them in some meaningful way to you towards the middle. So in the resources that I create with BootUp, I am intentionally have them mapped out so that every release that I create has some kind of a balance along that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And even within those resources, like there are project sequences, and then there are extensions, and then there's like remix opportunities. Like there's all these different ways of engaging with the same thing. So you can approach it from many different angles or perspectives. And that is very intentional by design, because I want kids to have that opportunity to kind of create in a way that works for them. Some kids prefer more open-ended stuff. Some kids might need more of this rigid, fixed criteria. And I think that's okay. It's hard to create those kind of resources because it takes a lot of time. And having like been the person who would teach a class in all day as my full-time gig, would then teach drumline at night, and then potentially take classes, grad classes, and then on the weekends and what weeknights I had off, creating all these resources. It's very difficult to do. So I'm grateful that I can do that full time with BootUp now, because like that's my gig, and I can now create these things for teachers who don't have that time. But that's kind of like my general approach.
Yeah, that's so useful. I really like that framework. The way that I had been doing things was I would create targeted resources for like specific kids and specific projects that kind of walk them through the problems that they're grappling with. I think that I was probably just like too close to their projects, that I was trying to create things that were so tailored that they didn't have to extrapolate at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that process of extrapolation is actually super valuable, because you're recontextualizing and trying to transfer knowledge. But then the other piece is like, there's so much in coding that is like, does it really matter if they discover how to do this, or can I just tell them?
Yeah, and kind of like expanding on the idea of looking at project-based learning as a continuum, there's also this continuum with undergrads in particular. I bring this up more than I do with some grad students, is that when you're working with kids, even though a lot of universities are talking about a constructivist approach or inquiry-based learning or project-based and facilitation and things like that, it's not at the cost of direct instruction. And it's not saying that you will never give direct instruction and the only thing you're going to do is respond to questions with questions 100% of the time. It's finding a balance and knowing when might it be more appropriate to respond with a question or guiding towards a resource or like a peer or something, and when might it be more appropriate to say a quick thing on how to do something or demonstrate or model or whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't have to just like completely avoid one approach in favor for a more progressive end. And the other way around, like you don't have to just lecture all the time.
Yeah, I kind of feel like in my teacher education journey, I kind of thought that I would be able to teach without doing direct instruction because we never like talked about direct instruction. It was discouraging for me to go into a classroom and be like, wow, I feel like I just lectured like for like 30 minutes and wow, they actually got it. Crap. you know, like am I bad because of that? No, of course not. That's not how it is.
What are some of the questions that you have for the field?
What are we doing about the large, powerful corporations that are controlling the infrastructure of computer science? I know that a lot of people have answers to that, but I specifically for CS Ed, what are we doing about that? And how can we be more effective in dismantling and disrupting the power structures that have started to kind of calcify? I'm basically like a single issue voter in that space. I don't mind kind of outing myself as someone who is really concerned about the power of these large corporations, and I'm very, very concerned about their presence in the classroom as kind of uncritical, benevolent deities that lord over the learning that happens in the classroom.
So where might people go to connect with you?
So I easiest to reach on Twitter. My handle is at jstapes, JSTAPES. But be forewarned that there's also some like D&D content on there. So it's not purely me ranting about CS education or music education. It's kind of all three of those things.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you consider sharing with a friend. Next week, we'll be back with another episode where I discuss some scholarship and unpack its potential implications.